Hello, my name is Adrian Duncan. I am an Irish writer. I'm currently on residency here in the Centre Culturel Irlandais um, as part of the Literature Ireland residency. I'm sitting at the moment in the old library in the Cultural Centre, and I was told that there's books in here from the 15th century or so. It's a really lovely, peaceful wall of books, essentially. So I'm here to read a short story from a collection that is coming out with Lilliput Press next March 2021. And the collection is called Midfield Dynamo. And the short story that I'm going to read, it's not a very long short story, but it's called Design Number 108. And a version of this story appeared in the Dublin Review back in, I'd say, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And the version in the collection is a little bit different from what was published back before, but it's not substantially different either. The collection of short stories are arranged in, what I'm working on at the moment is kind of the last MS of the book before it goes to Lilliput. And the collection it's a collection of 12 stories with, and it's arranged in 11 football players. Each story I perceive from it a sort of personality, and from that personality I give it a sort of field position on a football formation. So it looks something like this, the contents of the book. And from this, there become different ways of reading the book, I suppose, or different ways of interacting with the book, different orders for reading the stories, that kind of stuff. There's no preferred order. It's whatever order you think you prefer to read it in. But thinking about the pattern in the book, I felt it was best to put out a starting 11, essentially, of stories, because that's a kind of a structure that I'm very used to looking at, me being very interested in association football. So I just want to make sure that I don't need to thank anyone more. I'd like to thank, obviously, everyone at CCI, everyone at Literature Ireland, and everyone at Lilliput Press, and of course, the people at Dublin Review who published a version of this story back in 2011, I think it was. Okay, so I'm just going to read the story and then I will be off. So the story is called Design Number 108. When we were very young, my brother and I used to stand in front of the window of our sitting room and peer out at the world. Our house, I should say, is pure bungalow bliss, design number 108, the Hazels. Except for one tiny difference, the builders got the front living room window all wrong. It is massive. One night, when my parents went out drinking all over town, a storm blew in. The wind grew to a thunderous roar. My brother and I looked out through the wobbling, single glazed window and we held each other tight. With one particular gust, the pane of glass bulged and burst in upon us. A whole world of dust, leaf, branch and tree surged in and gathered us up in a confounding swirl, wherein I could see my brother being hurled towards a mirror. He hit it head first, then he fell to the floor, as did I. I clambered over to him and shouted through the gale, "Are you serious, sir?" He looked blankly back at me. A large shard of glass protruded from his cheek. I removed the glass, dragged him to the kitchen, closed all of the doors, dragged him onto the table, grabbed my father's chloroform cloth, knocked my brother out and operated on him. I cleaned the blood from his face, stitched his cheek together, rubbed salt water into the wounds and left him there to rest. Days later, with the wind still bellowing around our sitting room, I roused my brother and we left through the back door of our house into a calm and sunny autumnal day. We ran to the museum, where we usually found our parents after their binges. My father passed out on the steps and my mother sitting bolt upright. My mother gathered my brother and I up into her bosom and held us close. Many years from now, I will sit at my lamplit study desk and notice a large red blot of ink in my ledger, a blot absent-mindedly made with an old bingo marker, unearthed from a box after I had moved house at the end of a lifetime of many painful divorces, and I will think of my dear brother's face. When we were very young, my brother and I used to stand in front of the window of our sitting room and peer out at the world. Our house, I should say, is pure bungalow bliss, straight from the book, design number 108, the Hazels, except for one tiny difference. The builders got the split-level floor joists all wrong. My father, a builder and salt merchant, once came close to complete ruin. After many visits from a young bank manager whose manner was kind, my father was forced to sell his warehouses by the sea, his residential properties, all of his trucks, vans and lorries, and most of his salt stock. What was left of the stock was deposited one morning outside of our house and covered over with a protective sheet of white plastic. My father spent 4 months in bed. The autumn day he chose to re-enter the world was so clear that I was sure he would cry when he saw it. But he simply sat at the kitchen table and drank a cup of steaming coffee in a strange, deliberate manner. Eventually, he called the family to the table and said, "That, out there, under that white tarpaulin, is all I have left." We turned and looked at the white, quaking mound. "Underneath the sheet of plastic is 3 tons of salt brick," he said. "And," he said, "we must get it indoors before the winter comes." The 3 tons of salt were stacked on the upper part of our split-level home where the builders had built the joists incorrectly, and some creaking weeks later, the whole ziggurat of salt and timber and nail and dust came clattering down, crushing my dear brother, my mother, and me. As for my father, I have no way of telling what he did next or where he went. When we were very young, my brother and I used to stand in front of the window of our sitting room, peer out at the world. Our house, I should say, is pure bungalow bliss, straight from the book, design number 108, the Hazels, except for one tiny difference. The builders, unpaid for weeks, decided to build it with substandard blocks. After my father noticed cracks all over the building, he invited an engineer to carry out a survey. The engineer found that the walls had been built with cavity blocks cast with a large percentage of salt in them and were criminally substandard. Armed with this report, my father and his solicitor tracked down the builders and threatened to sue them into the ground. They agreed to rebuild the walls of the house inside the existing walls of salt block. I remember the hammering and churning and cursing and smoking around our abode, the strange men, their smells, their breath, their rough hands, the close quarters. The foreman on this job was handsome, and over the course of this rebuild, my mother's appearance and manner changed. You don't need me to describe her lingering around the site, the flirting, the predictable exposure, the schism, the confusion, the unfinished walls of our house, and my father's flight to the sea, his moon-glimmered thrashing, flailing, roaring, gulping, etc. When we were very young, my brother and I used to stand in front of the window of our sitting room, peer out at the world. He would lean forward, touch the window with his fingers, and then count from 1 to 100 over and over again, as if by doing so he could make the window disappear. I would ask him to stop. He would ignore me. Then we would fight like small beasts until one of us bled. "How is this sore for you?" the victor would cry. "Tell me now, how is this sore for you?" When we were very young, my brother and I would stand in front of the window of our sitting room, peer out at the world. Our house, I should say, is pure bungalow bliss, straight from the book, design number 108, the Hazels. Each Saturday morning, my brother, barefoot, would take to the roof and I to the attic. He would lasso around the chimney pot a harness he had fashioned of rope and tire tubing. Meanwhile, just below in the attic, I would sit and listen, and my mother beneath in the sitting room would kneel at the hearth and begin building the house fire. Then my brother would start abseiling around the chimney, it by now issuing skyward spirals of smoke from the fire my mother was preparing in the sitting room. Round and round my brother would go, thud, thud, thudding upon the clay tiles. He, this great centrifugal god of the skies, while I, in the attic, listened. I watched the tiny haphazard dumps of dust falling down from the battens, felt, and trusses each time his feet struck the roof, until these puffs of dust settled, all of them, in little piles, upon the boards of the attic floor, among the toys and tap and rubbish. Then I would hear my brother sitting on the ridge tiles, breathing heavily, and my mother would call up at me through the oblong of light in the floor of the attic, telling me I should come down for breakfast. I would hear her go outside and call my brother down, but he would just tell her to do one. One winter's morning, the whole place crusted with frost, my brother's harness gave way, and he slipped from the roof. For a moment he was exorbitant, untethered from the roof and the earth, until he landed in the yard on his head. He slept for 10 months. On the afternoon he woke, he leaned over to one side of his bed and threw up into a gleaming metal bucket endless, thunderous, strings of blood-yellow bile. Then he lay back, closed his eyes and smiled, and the autumn sun, shafting across the galaxies of boiling dust, through the hospital blinds and onto his red glistening lips, bounced, and finally came to rest upon the backs of my gaping eyes. My brother then sat up and announced to us all that he could no longer smell anything, and that whatever invisible filament of connection to the world we all enjoyed, he no longer had it, or wanted it, and, he said, that he felt sorry for us all, still so bound to the very things we wished to flee. Okay, well, thank you very much to anyone who has made it this far.